We turn now to domestic politics and a newsmaker interview with a man who recently came up with an unusual idea, running for the Democratic presidential nomination. He is Larry Agran, the former mayor of Irvine, California. And as correspondent Jeffrey Kay of public station KCET Los Angeles reports, he's a man who's accustomed to swimming against the tide.
As he prepared for the rigors of a national campaign, the candidate confronted what is sure to be a recurring theme: his relative obscurity.
My name, Larry Agran, is not exactly a household word, but I do hope that...
Agran, a 46-year-old activist lawyer, is hoping to overcome his lack of what the pollsters call name identification. He is trying to position himself as a voice for urban America.
Having served 12 years in local government, including 6 years as mayor of a city, during the 1980s when cities were being systematically defunded of resources, I had to, as a chief executive official in our community, grapple with all the problems that every American mayor has to grapple with. Homelessness, even hunger in our own community, poverty, the absence of child care facilities, environmental problems that just won't quit, air quality, water quality problems, transportation problems. These are the problems that the country faces.
Agran grew up in Los Angeles. He was student body president in high school, then active in the anti-war movement at the University of California at Berkeley. His wife is a local pediatrician, their son a senior at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. As an Irvine city official, Larry Agran led a local government that, in the words of the New York Times, turned the city into a crucible of municipal innovation.
Would the meeting please come to order?
Agran helped enact a social agenda that featured programs for child care, open space, and recycling. His government promoted slow growth and a low-income housing policy.
How much effect, when Irvine, California passes a law that bans CFCs, how much effect, A, is that going to have overall on the ozone layer? Because you've got a small town.
Well, first of all, it's not as small as you think. We're over 100...
Agran gained national attention in 1989 when he pushed through a law banning chemicals that deplete the Earth's ozone layer. He involved his city in global politics pertaining to trade, as well as arms reductions and environmental issues. His success with liberal policies belie the fundamental conservativeness of his Orange County city. Irvine is an affluent, 74% white Leave-It-to-Beaver community. 110,000 people live in a city whose master plan provides for man-made lakes, acres of manicured lawns, and tile-roofed homes in tracts that residents call villages. So how did Larry Agran, a liberal Democrat, succeed for so long in a city where there are 2 Republicans for each Democrat? Irvine resident Robert Scheer, a reporter for the Los Angeles Times, has one answer.
Agran's strength is that he knows that people here do want planned growth, slow growth. They don't want the place overwhelmed. One of the contradictions in Irvine is that we have a great deal of social planning here, of the kind that the Soviets should copy, effective social planning. We have community swimming pools and all sorts of facilities and laws about when you can leave your garage door open and when you can paint your house. And so, and people want that. They want planned growth that will increase their property value. The main thing that they're concerned about in this community is that property values go up. And everything Agran advocated helped property values go up. It's a clean, safe town with good schools, good police department, all of the things that attract new home buyers. And in the main, I think people were overwhelmingly pleased with Agran.
This isn't Montana, or Wyoming, or Wisconsin. It's Irvine. That's right, Irvine.
In 1990, during a re-election bid, Agran trumpeted his environmental policies. But he lost the election in the wake of his support for a controversial gay rights law.
Why don't you just tell us where this is going to be, how this is going to be organized?
This year, Agran headed a committee to resurrect a George McGovern campaign for president. But McGovern pulled out. Now, Agran, along with his campaign staff, believes he can raise enough money to qualify for federal matching funds for his own presidential bid.
Shortly before he officially announced his candidacy last week, Larry Agran talked with Roger Mudd.
Mr. Agran, I suppose most political reporters learned after Jimmy Carter became president to take all candidates seriously, but it does stretch credulity to think that a Jewish ex-mayor of a small suburban California town can make it. Does it stretch credulity?
Well, I don't think it stretches it to the breaking point. I was, of course, mayor of Irvine, California, a city of over 100,000 people. It's really one of the 200 largest cities in the United States of America, and had the opportunity to serve for 12 years, 6 of those years as mayor, learn a great deal not only about local government, but about the devastating effects of misplaced priorities in this country.
But Irvine is not like most cities. I mean, it's not a very old city. It's a master plan city. It's an almost all-white city. It's almost a spotless city. What is there about being mayor of Irvine that qualifies you to be president?
Well, first of all, Irvine is not nearly all white. We have worked long and hard to integrate our housing stock and otherwise build a truly integrated community. On top of that, yes, it is a planned community, and yes, we do have many blessings, open space, a far-reaching environmental protection program, but really I think Irvine is in many senses a microcosm of what is right and wrong with the country at large. That is to say that we are deprived in Irvine, as other communities are, of resources to truly improve the quality of life in terms of transportation, affordable housing, and all the other needs that exist in America, largely because we are squandering resources on a Cold War that is long since over.
I can't think of any other mayor who has been a presidential hopeful. Maybe Sam Yorty, remember him?
Yes.
And maybe John Lindsay. And Sam Yorty told me once the only reason he ran was so he could get good hotel space at the convention. But so tell me why you're running.
I'm running because I want to be a voice for the cities and towns of America. The cities and towns have incurred devastating cutbacks over the course of the last 10 or 12 years. The quality of life is diminishing by the day. Our cities are becoming sources of great insecurity rather than security for the American people. And I think that this kind of experience in cities and towns will allow me to describe to the American people what I call the new American security, based not on the force of arms, but upon capitalizing upon the end of the Cold War and redirecting those resources where they're so desperately needed.
So how would you redirect them?
Well, first of all, I think the President of the United States ought to set a date. I propose December 31st, 1994, as the date by which we not only reduce, but actually remove all permanent U.S. forces from Western Europe, as well as all forces from Japan. It's time to bring those troops home, to demobilize them to the maximum extent possible, and to cut military spending, which now amounts to some $200 billion a year, just for the defense of Western Europe and Japan and other outposts in Asia as well.
What would you do with the saving then?
With those savings, I would articulate not only a program, but underwrite it with real dollars to first and foremost send $25 billion to America's cities and towns, reenacting the old general revenue sharing program so as to rescue our cities and towns from the appalling conditions that now exist. We know how to build child care centers and reopen libraries. I'd add another $15 billion in redirected resources to public education. We have school districts that do a fine job. They just need the resources that are now being spent in Western Europe and Japan.
How would you, for what purpose would you spend the money in the school districts?
I would urge them, as the U.S. Conference of Mayors did in a report that I organized in 1987, I would encourage them to get the money to the school districts so as to rehire teachers who are now being laid off.
So you've told me about maybe $75 billion of the savings. What would you do with the other $1.25 billion?
Actually, I only told you about $40 billion.
40, all right,
Yes.
all right. You've lost me already.
I would
Keep
suggest
going.
that $40 billion additionally be part of underwriting an expanded Social Security program, not old age assistance, but beyond that, nutrition assistance, housing assistance, and I think most important, health security for people here in the United States of America. We have to begin building a public health and a national health insurance program that's going to cost a lot of money. And I would say that $40 billion ought to be earmarked for those purposes. Another $20 billion, I think, ought to be earmarked for environmental protection, restoration of our environment, cleaning up the toxic dumps, the nuclear waste sites, beginning to reforest the earth and do those things that we know are so desperately needed.
Were you against a Desert Storm Mr. Agran?
I was against the offensive aspect of that campaign, yes. I felt that the president was correct when he dispatched U.S. troops to interpose them at the Saudi border so as to see to it that the Iraqi transborder aggression didn't extend beyond Kuwait. I felt that move, coupled with sanctions, offered a program that, under the umbrella of the United Nations, had the chance of real success. In fact, the president, if you'll recall, said that this was an historic breakthrough in world history, where we had applied sanctions on an international basis that had the hope and the promise of reversing aggression.
Well, then, is it fair to say that you are a free-spending, liberal, anti-war Democrat, the type of which has been systematically rejected by the American voter for the last, 20 years?
Well, I don't know how free spending you could characterize me. As mayor, we had a $100 million a year budget and more. We balanced our budgets every year. We managed to do so amid declining resources from the federal government. I know what it takes to balance a budget. But beyond that, I know what it takes to build a society here at home. And the kind of deficits that we are incurring, not only financial deficits, but human deficits here at home, require an investment policy that we just don't have now. You know, it troubles a good many Americans, as it troubles me deeply, that we continue to spend on average $2,000 per American household for the defense of Europeans in Western Europe, for the defense of Japanese in Japan, each and every year. And we aren't spending anywhere near that amount to defend the interests of American citizens right here in Seattle and Detroit and Chicago and Los Angeles and all around the country.
What's the matter with the Democratic Party, Mr. Agran? The candidates are a one-term senator from Massachusetts. There is a governor of Arkansas perhaps going to announce. There is an ex-mayor of Irvine, California about to announce. Why aren't there the big giants of the Democratic Party running this time?
I think the party desperately needs to undertake the kind of soul-searching that we're going to experience in this campaign. It's a party that had supported a Cold War and Cold War budgets for decades. And now that the Cold War is over, the Democratic Party is going to have to decide whether we are going to take advantage of this opportunity, rebuild the country here at home by garnering those resources and redirecting them to our communities, where traditional democratic programs, and yes, liberal democratic programs, have historically worked to make our communities better. But we can't do that without the resources.
Looking over your biography, I read that you were a self-described Berkeley radical during the 60s. Is that an accurate description?
Well,
what did you do in the 60s, Mr. Agran?
I was a supporter of the free speech movement in Berkeley, yes, which was incidentally a completely nonviolent movement.
Right.
I was a graduate of UC Berkeley and went to Harvard Law School. I was a good student in every respect, and I was in many ways inspired by the struggles of the 1960s, the civil rights struggles, which were, I think, one of the milestones in American history, and of course, beyond that, the anti-war struggles. I was very much opposed to the war in Vietnam.
I noticed that you joined the Army Reserve when you were 17
yes.
and stayed in it until after you got out of college. Vice President Quayle got unshirted hell for doing that. Did you use the reserve to avoid going to Vietnam?
No, hardly. I didn't even know where Vietnam was when I joined the reserves. I joined in 1962.
Right.
Reserve service was an alternative to the draft, which was looming over everyone at that time, but it was a peacetime draft at that time. Vice President Quayle, of course, joined in an effort to avoid the draft, but to avoid it in time of war. I was quite frightened, I'll admit to you, during the 64 and 65 buildup that the reserves would have been called up. Had I been called up, of course, I would have had to go.
To qualify for matching funds, you got to raise $100,000 in 20 states, $5,000 per state minimum.
Yes.
How are you doing? Are you going to make it?
I think we'll make it.
Do you really?
We're going to use the next 60 to 90 days to get over that particular hurdle and assure people that this is the kind of credible campaign that merits note.
Well, perhaps we'll see you in New York.
I hope you will.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Democrats running for president have received little national exposure of their basic speeches, what it is they are saying. Tonight, correspondent David Dow reports on a declared Democratic candidate who, without question, is the least known in our series, Listening to the Candidates.
Hi, Larry Agran.
Larry Agran, self-admitted long shot, unabashed liberal Democrat, offers up what he calls the first true post-Cold War candidacy.
We have the opportunity now to cut military spending in half. Let me repeat that. We have the opportunity now to cut military spending in half. The B-2 bomber, MX deployment, Star Wars, all of those systems can now be cut and eliminated.
And that's not all.
And I think the next president of the United States has to set a date. I propose that that date be December 31st, 1994, by which time all U.S. military forces are withdrawn from Europe as well as from Japan.
Agran would redeploy the savings, he says $150 billion a year, back home on programs he calls the New American Security.
On top of that, I think we need to invest $40 billion a year in health security, in income security, in nutrition security, in building, step by step, a comprehensive social security system. We could redirect $25 billion in emergency assistance to the cities and towns of America. It would be like the old general revenue sharing program, no strings attached. We ought to earmark $15 billion to be sent to the public school districts across the country.
Plus another $70 billion a year for the environment and deficit reduction. Agran says his program would put the Democratic Party back on track.
The Democratic Party has got to get up off its knees and start doing its job as the traditional source of liberal programs that serve the interests of the American people.
David Dow, CBS News, Montecito, California.
Next, the 1992 presidential campaign, which finally came to life this weekend when the Democrats produced not one, but 7 firm or maybe candidates. In a moment, we will talk about them with 2 former presidential campaign managers. But first, this sampling of what they had to say from correspondent Tom Bearden.
This meeting of the Democratic National Committee is now called to order.
With those words, DNC Chairman Ron Brown signaled the beginning of the 1992 presidential sweepstakes. For the party leaders and organizers assembled in Los Angeles, this was their opportunity to hear firsthand a parade of potential prospects. Larry Agran, the former progressive mayor of Irvine, California, a city in the midst of heavily Republican Orange County, stressed the plight of the nation's cities.
I want to see the Democratic Party become a crucible of national innovation. And the way we're going to do that, is by confronting the new realities, the new opportunities that are before us. We have to seize the opportunity to reshape national priorities, to cut the military budget in half, to bring home $150 billion per year and rebuild this country here at home, regardless of what the future holds for me personally. I want in this campaign to be the voice of America's cities and towns. I want to be the voice for the people who live there. I want you to hear my voice, but more important, I want you to hear their voices. The voice of the people who have become dispossessed, who have grown disillusioned, who are despairing, who are wondering whether or not the Democratic Party has within itself the resources to rediscover its heart and its soul, to rediscover its point and its purpose, to rediscover the traditional values that once made this party such a vibrant part of American life. I believe that the Democratic Party can be that party of hope, but we're going to have to earn the trust of the American people. And the way we will earn the trust of the American people is by talking sense to the American people, is by spelling out in specific terms the hope, the opportunity for new priorities that can make this country great again. And if we do that, I promise you, we will build the base to see to it that the next President of the United States is indeed a Democrat committed to those values that we share. Thank you very much.
From Sioux Falls, South Dakota, South Dakota Public Television and Radio present live coverage of the South Dakota Democratic Presidential Primary Candidate Forum. And now, here's the moderator of tonight's program, Cable News Network correspondent and analyst, Ken Bowden.
Welcome to Election 92, the South Dakota Presidential Primary Candidate Forum. Tonight's forum is sponsored by the South Dakota Democratic Party as part of its annual Jefferson-Jackson Day celebration. Also, the forum is being broadcast statewide by South Dakota Public Radio and Television and nationally on C-SPAN. I'll be asking the candidates assembled here tonight questions about issues that affect the people of South Dakota and rural America. Tonight's forum will be broken into 6 segments. We will have discussions on the economy, agriculture and rural development, healthcare costs and access to healthcare, the environment, and Native American affairs. And we'll also have closing statements by each candidate. If time allows, we may get into some other subjects as well. The major rule we are operating under tonight is a simple one: basic fairness and common decency. The candidates have been instructed to try to keep their responses to 90 seconds or less. The order in which the candidates are seated on the stage here tonight and in which they will take questions has been determined by drawing lots. Each of the candidates will have the opportunity to answer at least one question from every subject matter first, except for Senator Tsongas, who has elected to give his closing remarks last. All those things determined by lot. Also, we'd like to ask one thing of our audience here in Sioux Falls tonight. Please do not applaud or cheer your candidate's responses. You'll only be taking time away from him and from all the rest of us in terms of the issues we'll be able to discuss. Now let's meet the candidates. They are, from my left, Governor Bill Clinton, Governor of Arkansas. Former Governor Jerry Brown of California. Bob Kerrey, Senator from Nebraska. Paul Tsongas, former Senator from Massachusetts. Tom Harkin, Senator from Iowa. And Larry Agran, former mayor of Irvine, California. Just one more word to the candidates. This is the first time you've all been together in a forum like this since the New Hampshire primary and since the New Hampshire economy was the major issue you faced. Our questions tonight will have a lot more of a Midwestern focus, Midwestern flavor. I'll try to put them to you more in terms of what an ordinary citizen might ask you, and I hope your answers will be along the same lines. Most of us are just getting acquainted with you. One of the things that several people on this stage tonight support is a middle-class tax cut. How do you stand on the middle-class tax cut?
I'm opposed to the middle-class tax cut as it's proposed. I think that the last thing we need on top of a $350 to $400 billion a year deficit is to add yet more dollars in deficit. What we ought to be doing is levying a 1% wealth tax in this country. Now, many of you know that I've talked about reorganizing national priorities, cutting our military budget in half, bringing home a $150 billion a year peace dividend, and doing it not in 10 years, as others here propose, but doing it right here, right now, right away. We can't wait, and the Cold War is over. It's time for us to claim its benefits. I've argued that $50 billion of that $150 billion ought to be earmarked for honest deficit reduction, but that's not enough. On top of that, we need a 1% wealth tax. What that means is that we would identify the 1% wealthiest households in the country and levy a 1% tax on all their aggregate wealth. This would generate a $30 to $50 billion a year pool of tax money, new revenue, that would help us reduce this deficit. And when you add to it Paul Tsongas' tax on energy, we're darn near the closing of the gap on the budget deficit. So what we have to do is be honest with people, not pander to voters by way of a middle-class tax cut, a general across-the-board tax cut, which only means heaping further debt on our kids and on their kids.
Senator?
I want to say a word here. That,
Governor?
You know, the trouble is those with the least power get the least hearing in Washington. The whole basis of my campaign is that there are two views of the world. There's inside the Beltway, inside Washington. It's a world of obscene pay raises for the senators, and two of them here, I have to acknowledge, did vote for them. And it's also a view of the world that Egypt and the Middle East and all other places are more important than a family farmer or a small businessman or just individual families. And I would say, and this gets right to the point, that people have lost their farms because they didn't have the ability to pay back loans at the very time when our president was giving $7 billion to Egypt, when we're giving $18 to $20 billion in foreign aid. And I'd like to make the point, what is needed here is a reorientation to America. And I would say this, I wouldn't give a penny in foreign aid until every small farmer and businessman and family in this country was taken care of. And that's what's wrong with this policy right now. Those are the international people, the people in Washington, they're taken care of, and Americans are getting short shrift. That's the problem. And you got to fight that, or all the special little programs mean nothing, because they all get carved up by the money, the lobbyists, and the lawyers who own Congress. That's why I won't take any more than $100, because we, the people, have to change it, and we will.
Mayor Agran.
Yes, Jim. I want to speak to the farming question, but first I want to speak to the common decency and fairness question. You know, this is one of the first times in recent weeks that I've been allowed to participate with these gentlemen, notwithstanding the fact I'm on 36 ballots across the country. There's no other Democrat in America who is on the ballot in state after state, but who has not been participating in nationally televised debates. And when I hear Jerry Brown, the grand champion of raising special interest money through the 70s and 80s, giving lectures to the rest of us about special interest domination, I'm up to here with it. I'm up to here with it. And I'll tell you something else.
Well, then why don't you follow it? Why don't you take the same policy of not
Because I have never accepted PAC money. I have never accepted PAC money. You have raised tens of millions of dollars in California and elsewhere.
I have. That's
and
why
you're
I know
a Jerry come lately to campaign finance reform.
That's not true.
We're going to get
back.
That's
why I know this.
Now let me say with respect to farm policy.
I hope you will follow your policy, because you're not.
Now let me say with respect.
Just a second, Mr. Mayor Agran. What we're going to do right now, I want to have a dialogue here tonight, and I think we. What'd you say? I've got a whip, and you can lash us all. What I would like to do, I don't want to, for South Dakota. Small towns have a tremendously difficult time attracting and keeping doctors. Small hospitals, because of inequities in the way that Medicare money is allocated, have a hard time in treating people at any kind of a profit. These factors have forced many South Dakotans to drive long distances to even get the most basic health care, up to 100 miles to a hospital sometimes. How will your health plan improve service in the small towns and rural populations of a state like South Dakota?
The idea of national health insurance is the compelling idea of our time. And if we put national health insurance in place on an emergency basis, the fact of the matter is that dollars for medical care will be available in rural communities. People will have access to a health insurance plan by way of a card, by way of a publicly financed system, and that will attract doctors and others to rural areas so that they too will get a fair measure of health care. Let me say something else about this health care business too. If we begin to think ahead, we can actually overcome many of the intractable problems we have faced with respect to health and moral issues in our society. For example, a decent national health insurance plan ought to have written right into it the full range of reproductive choice, so that any individual with a health insurance card can go to any physician, any health clinic, and be entitled to the full range of reproductive choice, contraceptive information, contraceptive supplies, as well as the right to a safe, legal abortion anywhere in the United States of America. This ought to be part and parcel of a health insurance plan. Let me say something else, too. The question of drug treatment, drug education, that ought to be folded right into national health insurance. So should alcohol recovery programs, smoking cessation clinics. All this is going to cost money. That's why I've said we've got to have a $150 billion a year peace dividend, out of which we carve and dedicate $40 billion a year to underwrite the costs that we're going to have to incur to make health care available as a matter of right to each and every American.
Governor Brown, the first question on the environment. Mr. Agran, one of the biggest environmental issues in recent years in South Dakota is whether or not this state should landfill other states, particularly eastern states, garbage. Landfills in the more populous states seem to be filling up. Do Midwestern states and Great Plains states like South Dakota have a responsibility to take in other states' garbage? And how would you go about solving the nation's solid waste problems?
No, they don't have that responsibility to take other people's garbage. As a matter of fact, in the city of Irvine, we received an environmental award from the United Nations for 3 environmentally important breakthrough programs. One was setting aside 16,000 acres of open space for permanent preservation, including agricultural lands. The second was adopting an ordinance banning the emissions of CFCs and other ozone-depleting compounds, a pioneering ordinance that's been copied by cities around the world. And the third was recycling. We discovered that recycling can be done in your own community in a way as to reduce the waste stream dramatically. And this ought to be the case everywhere as a matter of national and local policy. It applies to nuclear energy as well. This idea of producing nuclear energy, as Paul Tsongas wants to do, and then dumping the waste in Nevada, that makes no sense at all. State against state, person to person, opposition to one another, makes no sense at all. But let me tell you, cleaning up this environment is going to cost one heck of a lot of money. I propose that we set aside $20 billion a year out of this $150 billion a year peace dividend for stepped up environmental protection, reforestation, cleaning up our toxic and nuclear waste sites, family planning around the world, doing all those things that have to be done. But I'm getting a little concerned hearing over and over again here what we have to do by way of education, health care, fixing up our economy, rebuilding the infrastructure, you name it. We all have a plan. Where's the money coming from? Not one person yet has talked about cutting that military budget in half and doing it right now to give us the wherewithal to rebuild the American economy, address these environmental concerns, and be attentive to national and international concerns at the same time.
Senator Larry, I've been talking about cutting the military budget in half for some time now.
Yeah, Jerry, you're the one who was for the B-1 bomber in the early 80s when we were working against it.
Okay.
It cost us $50 billion for a damn plane that doesn't fly.
Californians seem to want to take the gloves off on each other here tonight. Senator Tsongas, you come from
deserve all this attention.
You come from an eastern state. What do you say about the question that I asked Mayor Agran?
Well, the fact is, the mayor is correct. I hope I don't offend you by agreeing with you.
No. Just don't send me your nuclear waste.
That's good.
1980, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the 7.5 million acres of the Black Hills had been taken illegally from the Lakota Sioux Nation. Senator Bill Bradley of New Jersey has sponsored a bill that would return 1.3 million acres of those federal Forest Service lands in the Black Hills to the Great Sioux Nation. The South Dakota congressional delegation and the governor have opposed that measure. Do you favor a return of all or part of the federal lands in the Black Hills to the Lakota, Dakota people? Haven't you?
Yes, I've been to the Pine Ridge Reservation. Let me say, just so he'll relax a little bit, I generally agree with Jerry Brown on this issue. But let me go beyond that specifically. I believe the next president of the United States has to be big enough and strong enough to take a different approach, to come here to South Dakota, to see to it that the long, bitter trail of tears ends here in South Dakota. And that new president ought to bring with him his Secretary of State and sit down with the representatives of the Indian nations and negotiate here in the Midwest the kinds of binding treaties that can address the issues of sovereignty, of land, of mineral rights, and reconcile the differences that have been so terrible over the years. He ought to come as well with an apology for what has transpired. We need to move through this grieving process and into a negotiated treaty between and among great nations that will supplant and replace all the broken treaties of the past and let us move on to the future.
Mayor Agran, it's an apology specifically for what transpired at Wounded Knee. Would you favor that?
Well, yes, not only what transpired at Wounded Knee, but what has transpired throughout decades, over hundreds of years of American history. We have to own up to that. You know, we've been demanding of the Japanese an apology for Pearl Harbor. That's right. We have apologized to the Japanese Americans here in the United States for incarcerating them during World War II. We have to be practitioners of human rights. And that means we have to have a president who is strong enough and big enough to come here to South Dakota. Just as now we are trying to negotiate peace in the Middle East, we have to negotiate peace in the Middle West as well. And we have to give it every bit as much attention as we are those negotiations in the Middle East.
I don't think there is a more important issue to the Native Americans of this state, so I'm going to take this right to everybody and ask everybody on the panel to answer this same question. American Affairs, the infant mortality rate is 3 times as high as the national average, and fetal alcohol syndrome is the cause of 50% of all learning disabilities in Indian children in South Dakota. Reservation health services are terribly understaffed. Mayor Agran, how would you handle that?
I think this ought to be part of the negotiated settlement of all outstanding concerns. You know, one of the problems is that we think we can buy our way out of every problem. We can't. If the Indians wanted to take the money, they would take the money and run. There is another interest that they are pursuing here, which is the interest of dignity, self-determination, control over their own resources, control over their own destiny. And I think if leaders of great nations can be called together in the Middle East to negotiate a peace settlement there, then certainly the President of the United States and the Secretary of State ought to sit down here with the leaders of the great Indian nations and negotiate all of these matters. That includes compensation, new programs. It includes an array of considerations. Let me say this, too. I think it's very important that we recognize that people want to control their own affairs. They don't want to be getting money from Washington, D.C. to take care of local health concerns. They want to be having control over their own destiny. That means having a nation that is self-governing. That means adhering to the principle of self-determination. And that means taking seriously this proposal for a negotiated treaty that resolves all of these outstanding concerns.
Governor, concludes the subject area section of our debate. Thank you very much. The candidates now have 1 minute and 30 seconds to answer the following question for us. Why should the voters of South Dakota vote for you for president in Tuesday's primary election? Mr. Agran, you have the next closing statement.
Yes, I want to make Jerry Brown feel still more comfortable. Here's my 800 number. And for those of you who are out there in radio land, it's 1-800-727-9425. People throughout America haven't had a chance to see much of my 800 number. Let me tell you why. We've got a problem with democracy in this country. We've got a problem with democracy in this party. I have been campaigning long and hard since August 22nd on a program of what I call the New American Security, measured not by the force of arms abroad, but by the strength of our society here at home. I'm the only one calling for immediate steps to cut our military budget in half, to bring our forces home from Europe, to cancel needless weapon systems, to end foreign aid, to deliver a peace dividend to the American people. I think that's an important message worthy of an airing to the American people. And yet each of these gentlemen have been asked by me, directly or indirectly, to allow me to participate in nationally televised debates. And they have refused to stand up for that democratic principle of inclusion, notwithstanding the fact that my name is on the ballot in over 35 states. No other person in America beyond these 5 is on the ballot in 35 states. I think I have the right to be heard. And I ask you to ask yourself this question. If my voice can't be heard, what do you think the chances are of your voice being heard? If I can't be included in these forums and debates, what do you think the chances are that you'll be included in the governance of our country? Vote on Tuesday for new national priorities. Vote also for someone who's ready to stand up for the democratic principles of inclusion that have made our party and our country great.
Thank you, Mr. Agran. Senator Kim.
Next, we take you to the Capitol Hilton Hotel here in Washington, D.C. for live C-SPAN coverage of a presidential forum for Democratic candidates entitled Future of America's Cities. The event is part of the U.S. Conference of Mayors annual winter meeting and will feature remarks by 5 Democratic presidential candidates. Tonight, you'll hear from former Irvine, California Mayor Larry Agran, former California Governor Jerry Brown, Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton, U.S. Senator John Kerry of Nebraska, and former Massachusetts Senator Paul Tsongas.
Evening are Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton, former Massachusetts Senator Paul Tsongas, Nebraska Senator Bob Kerrey, former California Governor Jerry Brown, former Irvine, California Mayor Larry Agran, Mayor Agran.
Yes, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here again with you and among you as a former mayor. I want to assure those mayors in the audience that there is life after mayor, that there is something useful to do after having served your own community as I served mine. Shortly after I got into this presidential race in August, Maynard Jackson, the mayor of Atlanta, was on Meet the Press, and he said he thought that the next president of the United States ought to be someone who's had governing experience as the mayor of an American city. And I thought that was a pretty good idea then, Mayor Jackson, and I still think it's a good idea. Because we bring, thank you, and if you're clapping for Ray Flynn or some of the other highly qualified mayors, that's all right too. Because we have a unique perspective to bring to bear to national politics. We have an important perspective. I know all the candidates now are coming out with books, and I've got my own official statements. Paul, I want to tell you, I'm probably one of the few people in America who has actually read your book cover to cover. I did it in one night without falling asleep, and it has a great many fine ideas for America. But we wrote our own book. Right here, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, we wrote our own book in 1987 and 1988. I authored a national priorities resolution which suggested that it was time to cut the military budget by 10%. $30 billion. We passed that resolution. I spoke with Mayor Harold Washington. I was probably the last mayor to talk with him before he passed away. He agreed to put $20,000 into the study. I got my city to put $5,000 in. We got some other cities to participate. And the U.S. Conference of Mayors put together this study that pointed out that if we were to cut the military budget and shift its spending to America's cities, that we would regenerate America's cities with health care, with housing, with transportation improvements, with all manner of public services. And on top of it, the net addition of jobs would be 195,000. I tell you, if Michael Dukakis had run on this platform in 1988, he would be president today. What we need is the first Cold War, post-Cold War president in the United States of America. We need a candidate who has a post-Cold War vision. And in my candidacy, I try to bring that to the American people. Here in 1992, with the Berlin Wall down, with the Cold War behind us, we have an opportunity to cut the military budget not by 10%, but by 50%. And not in 10 years, but immediately. We ought to do this in three specific ways. Bring home our troops from Europe and Japan and do that right now. We're spending $200 billion a year on the defense of Western Europe and Japan against an enemy that no longer exists. We need to cancel the B-2 bomber, the MX missile deployment system in Star Wars, and convert those contracts to contracts for rapid transit, for energy-efficient heating and cooling systems, for fixing our infrastructure in our cities, for putting people to work by the millions. We need to also cancel foreign military aid, and altogether bring home to the American people a peace dividend of $150 billion, the first $25 billion of which earmarked for direct aid to cities and towns in the United States of America. $100 per resident per year, the same as the old general revenue sharing program. No strings attached, no corruption, sending the money to the localities and let them decide what needs to be done first. The next $15 billion ought to be earmarked for direct assistance to public school districts, $375 per student per year. Get the money to the school districts, they'll educate our kids. Third,
National health insurance. I like Senator Kerry's plan. I like Senator Tsongas's plan. But it's going to cost money. There needs to be $40 billion at least for a down payment on national health insurance to make it meaningful. Next, we have to bring home $20 billion out of this peace dividend for stepped-up environmental protection, cleaning up our toxic and nuclear waste sites, reforesting the earth, cleaning up our water, our air. That's going to cost real money, and the money's got to be there in the cities and towns. And finally, all of this leaves $50 billion out of this massive peace dividend. $50 billion that ought to be earmarked for two final purposes. One, some honest deficit reduction in this country. Not smoke and mirrors, but honest deficit reduction. And two, the kind of national economic conversion planning that has as its centerpiece what I call a defense workers' bill of rights. Now that the Cold War is over, we want to harness the scientists, the engineers who previously had been employed building weapons of mass destruction to the tasks of building modern transit systems, energy-efficient heating and cooling systems, and rebuilding our American cities. There you have it, a plan for America, a specific plan that ought to be at the heart of the debate in 1992.
Thank you, Mayor.
A hearing on a shocking report entitled Hunger and Homelessness in the United States. Mr. Agran, we believe that it's a solvable problem, hunger and homelessness. The will is there, the money is not there. What would you do as President of the United States to end homelessness in America and to feed the millions of young people that go to bed each night in our cities and communities all across this country to end hunger in America?
Mayor Flynn, you, of course, have led the way in raising this issue and addressing this problem nationally, trying to shock people into the reality of what's going on in this country. Most people understand the conditions have declined, the conditions have worsened in American cities. We have 13 million children mired in poverty, 35 million Americans mired in poverty. Hunger and homelessness existed in my city as well, Irvine, California, not thought of as a poor city. The fact that these things go on in the United States of America today, that fact is a disgrace. We know how to feed people, we know how to clothe people, we know how to house people, we know how to do all those things in America's cities. We simply have to have the resources. That's why I've proposed the $25 billion out of this massive military budget that's no longer needed, that we can cut in half tomorrow. The $25 billion be earmarked for what is effectively general revenue sharing to cities and towns. When the money gets to the mayors and to the council members, I know that they will construct the programs to feed people who are hungry, to shelter people who need shelter, to build affordable housing, to rebuild our cities and towns. This has been the tradition of self-government in this country. And I call myself a liberal Democrat, a progressive Democrat, but most of all, I like to call myself a self-government Democrat, believing that the people fundamentally will do the right thing if they have the resources. You know, Washington, D.C. is probably the only city in America where grown men and women could actually step over hungry and homeless people, go into the Capitol, and pursuant to a mandate by the administration, vote to deprive the cities and towns of general revenue sharing, as was done in 1987. Deprive the cities and towns of what was then a meager $3.4 million, and 2 weeks later, vote $3.5 million for Star Wars. Isn't it time to change national priorities and begin right now?
Thank you, Mayor.
To date, over 200,000 Americans have been diagnosed with AIDS. By the end of next year, 200,000 Americans will have died from AIDS. As President of the United States, what will you do to deal with this epidemic that is affecting Americans all across this country?
I'd like to respond to that as well. I support national health insurance as a means of providing decent, comprehensive treatment for AIDS and all other ailments for all Americans. I have a question, though, about the wisdom of levying further taxes on the American people at a time when we still have troops stationed in Western Europe and Japan, when we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars every year defending societies that on their own have national health insurance programs that are better than our own. That just doesn't make sense. Let's bring those resources home and build a national health insurance system that we can be proud of. That system should also include reproductive choice, so that we take this out of the political debate and let people choose on their own pursuant to a health care system. Let me add, with respect to AIDS, Mayor Flynn, I have the greatest admiration for you, but you are wrong on the question of condoms and not making condoms available to people upon request, including teenagers. We are dealing here with a lethal epidemic, a public health calamity of unprecedented proportions. Not only must condoms be made available, but sterile needles to drug users. We have to grow up and be ready to wage this war against this public health calamity and to be prepared to win it by being honest with our kids and with ourselves and being honest about our future.
Senator, it's a simple yes or no answer. If nominated for the presidency, would you seriously, to all candidates, give serious consideration to selecting a mayor as your vice presidential running mate? Yes or no?
Yes. I commit to you right now.
I'm pushing Flynn.
Should we leave you two alone here to discuss this? Yes.
Yes, but the yes is to a considering. That's all you've gotten so far. But a strong yes to that.
Are you going to make a commitment, Jerry? Give it to him.
It's a yes, but I heard you say yes, I'm going to consider it. I didn't hear yes, you're going to do it. Now, maybe that's a fine point.
Mayor?
Yes. But that's the way politics works.
Well, my answer is yes. I'd worry about the possible imbalance of two mayors running the White House and the country. But I certainly think, and this is an important point, that mayors have the unique experience of governance that ought to be part and parcel of the American fabric of governance. That's one subtle message that I'm trying to bring to bear in this campaign.
Thank you.
And I thank the opportunity for doing so tonight.
We are at the end of the hour. I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to thank both panels. And finally, we have begun to focus in a major way on the specific needs of America's cities, and I think that's progress. Thank you. You've been a great audience.
Hello, I'm Hugh Hewitt, a conservative columnist, radio host on KFI in Los Angeles, and co-host of KCET Public Television in Los Angeles, Life and Times. I'm pleased to participate in public television's series of interviews with candidates for the Democratic presidential nomination. And tonight's interview is with Larry Agran, one-time mayor of the city of Irvine, a candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination since August of 1991. Thank you, Larry, for being here.
Thank you.
First question really is, you've been campaigning since August of last year. You have only a handful of delegates committed to your nomination when the party convenes in New York to nominate a front runner. Why on June 2nd, then, should anyone vote for you as opposed to Bill Clinton or Jerry Brown in the California primary?
Well, at this point, it is clear that Governor Clinton will be the Democratic Party nominee. It's clear that Governor Brown stands no chance to be the nominee. It's clear that I stand no chance to be the nominee. The real question is, what will our party stand for? What will our party's platform look like? What will our party's nominee's campaign be all about? And my candidacy, my continuing candidacy, is an effort to make it clear that the Democratic Party must stand for bold, new national priorities now that the Cold War is over. We have to be the party that puts Cold War budgets behind us and now articulates a program and a platform to reconstruct America from the neighborhoods right on up. That means a clear departure from the candidacies and the campaigns of the past.
When you launched this campaign in the first speech, you talked about a new American security. Many thought that was quixotic. They thought it was an emblem. What did you mean by that, and has that caught on in other people's rhetoric?
It has caught on. It's caught on for good reason. I said at the time that I announced last August that I wanted to be a voice for the cities and towns and the people who live there throughout America. I wanted to be, in a sense, an urban or metropolitan candidate, somebody who could speak to the question of national priorities as it affects the everyday quality of life in our cities and towns and communities. This was intended to be a criticism not only of the Reagan and Bush years that have involved the systematic defunding of every decent program in housing, transportation, social services, health. Every program was defunded one way or another throughout the 1980s. I, as a mayor, spoke out against that. I spoke out as well for a dramatic change in priorities that would have us cut military expenditures abroad, cut the $300 billion a year military budget in half, bring those resources home, and begin rebuilding the country. Now, this was not only a question of criticism of the Reagan and Bush years, it was a question as well as of criticizing a Democratic Congress that had been complicit in these Cold War budgets and Cold War priorities.
Now, you talk about a 50% cut in defense spending immediately. Many view that as radical and as beyond possibility. In fact, I believe it's way beyond possibility. Have you got any studies? Did you do any runs on the numbers to show that that, in fact, would be possible to do, bring it down 50% in 1 year?
We have not only studies, because I helped organize the U.S. Conference of Mayors landmark study, a shift in military spending to America's cities and towns. This was a 1987-88 study demonstrating that we actually, for every $1 billion we cut from the military budget and invested in public health programs and housing and transportation, we actually would be producing net an increase of 7,000 jobs. But beyond that, we would be investing in our infrastructure, rebuilding our society. But beyond these studies, we have the proof of what happened after World War II. You know, Harry Truman, when he was president, cut the military budget, which in 1945 was the equivalent of $800 billion in today's dollars. $800 billion, and he cut that budget 86% in just 3 years. Now, if we could do that in 45 and 46 and 47, why can't we cut the budget 50% now, especially since our enemy no longer exists?
What would you say to the people of Southern California in particular, though it would have ramifications in Northern California, that these kinds of defense cuts are going to mean an already beleaguered defense industry is going to be flat on its back and these people are going to lose their jobs?
Not so. Let me tell you why. First of all, most of our expenditures for military purposes are in Europe and Japan. Fully 2/3 of our entire military budget is for the defense of Western Europe and Japan. As a matter of fact, we're spending more on the defense of cities in Europe than we are to defend the interests of citizens in America's cities and towns. It's preposterous. Now, if we were to bring those troops home and the equipment, bring the dependents home, bring the supplies home, use U.S. military bases as staging points for a reformulated and restructured defense of the United States of America, we would keep people employed on those bases. We could also keep aerospace engineers, scientists, production workers employed, doing the things we really have to do. For example, here in Southern California, doesn't it make sense that we harness that scientific genius to teach people, once again, to build a modern rail transportation system for Southern California? Light rail, heavy rail, energy-efficient heating and cooling systems, affordable housing. The scientific and technical genius that is here ought to be harnessed for those purposes. And it ought to be harnessed by converting the existing contracts that we have. In other words, instead of building a B-2 bomber, the people who are dedicated to doing that now ought to be told, stop. Stop what you're doing. Use the money instead to take the next 6 months to a year to sit around a table and otherwise learn how to build a prototypical rail system, relying upon Japanese consultation, Swiss consultation, Canadian consultation, whatever it takes to make this transformation. But during the transformation period, we will guarantee you continuing employment, job security, income, advanced education if necessary, a real GI Bill of Rights that I call a Defense Workers Bill of Rights for aerospace industry personnel.
Now, tonight might be the first time that many people in California are hearing you address the issues at length if they missed your appearances on MacNeil, Lehrer, or Larry King. And that is owing probably to what I have to call systematic blackout of major American media in tandem with your own party. The Democratic Party has worked systematically to keep you out of debates across the country, even though you are on the ballot in most of the major states, and even though you had qualified recently for presidential matching funds. What's going on in the Democratic Party that they're afraid of a former mayor preaching a 50% defense cut?
I think they are worried about that message because it challenges Democratic Party orthodoxy over the course of the last 10 to 12 years that has had Democrats, one after the other, embracing these Cold War budgets long after the Cold War is over. That makes not only the Democratic Party uncomfortable, I'm a lifelong Democrat, but it also makes the leading candidates uncomfortable. Governor Clinton, Governor Brown, and others who historically have embraced and endorsed these kinds of budgets. I think the party in a major way is undergoing something on the order of a nervous breakdown. We're going to have to decide who we are as a Democratic Party, what it is we stand for. If we want to be a get-along party that is pretty comfortable with the Reagan-Bush budgets, that's the kind of party and I think the kind of campaign that is going to be rejected in November. If, on the other hand, we're willing to break with all of that, it will make a real difference. Now, I do hold accountable Ron Brown, chairman of the Democratic National Committee, who has not been helpful to me at all, who from the beginning wanted a field that was very narrow. He wanted a decision that was made very early. He tilted for Governor Clinton from the very beginning, and as a result, we have the greatest outpouring of public dissatisfaction toward both major party nominees that has ever been seen in modern history.
Do you attribute some of the Ross Perot bubble to the fact that the Democratic Party has, in effect, engineered the Clinton nomination?
I do. I see the Perot boomlet, it may be more than a boomlet over time, as a manifestation of absolute disgust that people feel from one end of this country to the other toward the two major parties.
Okay, now, people out there who might be inclined not to vote for Clinton and not to vote for Brown because they just don't measure up on what they're thinking. People who are Green Party, people who are Feminist Party, will want to know what you stand for on a number of issues. So let's run down a laundry list just to fill out the picture. Abortion rights.
I'm pro-choice. I always have been pro-choice. My wife's a pediatrician. We have spoken out publicly on these issues. We believe that choice involves questions of privacy as well. Let me make one more suggestion in regard to this. I am the only candidate who has talked about folding right into the national health insurance law that we need to write in this country the right to a safe, legal abortion as a condition, as a right that is guaranteed under national health insurance, as well as other preventive services, I might add.
So that would tip your hand on federal funding for abortions as well?
Absolutely.
And you would support federal funding for abortion?
Yes.
On the environment in the city of Irvine, people recognize you're the author of the first CFC ordinance governing locally. Is that a consistent environmental position throughout all of your platform?
Yes, I believe that what we have demonstrated at the local level, what we were able to do by way of open space preservation, curbside recycling, the toughest, most comprehensive ordinance, eliminating CFCs and other ozone-depleting compounds, these were demonstrations of the fact that we can organize our resources and our economic activity in a way to protect not only the local environment, not only the national environment, but the global environment as well.
But now some of the environmental lobby are coming under attack, and the Air Quality Management District in Southern California and the Bay Area Quality District are both attacked as forcing jobs to flee California. Can we afford the price of an environmental agenda as ambitious as yours is?
I think it's not a question of jobs versus environmental protection. As a matter of fact, this is one of the few areas where we excel. As a country, we could actually develop environmental protection control systems that we export to countries all over the world. There's no reason why we have to just apply those technologies here at home. We ought to be extending them around the world so that the developing economies won't go through the pollution phase that our own economy has experienced as a result of its development over many, many decades. When you talk about China, when you talk about India, these economies that are searching for development, well, wouldn't it be great if we could be the link that provided technologies that permitted them to advance, but without polluting the world?
Okay, continuing on this list of issues, taxes, are they too high, are they too low, are they just about right?
Well, I would say that, generally speaking, they're all. They're too high for the poorest people in our society, too low for the wealthiest people in our society, and about right for people in the $50,000, $60,000 a year income range. We have to recognize the fact that we've got a $400 billion a year deficit now. It's a staggering amount. Liberals as well as conservatives have to be responsive to this reality. So I've called for cutting the military budget, bringing those resources home, earmarking a third of that peace dividend for deficit reduction, but doing more by way of deficit reduction by imposing a tax on the wealthiest people in our society, an income tax surcharge, but in addition to that, a wealth tax. I'm the only candidate calling for a 1% tax on the aggregate wealth of the 1% wealthiest households in this country, people who have millions of dollars and who can help us reduce the deficit by doing more in the way of a fair share contribution.
How much revenue would that raise?
It would raise between $25 and $50 billion a year, depending on how it were structured.
Okay. Does the Democratic Party have any credibility at all? And again, you're part of the Democratic Party. When they talk about deficit reduction, Larry Agran, you've been the mayor of a city, you balance budgets. We'll recognize that. But does the Democratic Party and the Democratic Party that has controlled the Congress for 40 years have any credibility on the idea of deficit reduction?
Well, I like to think that I have some credibility. Of course, as having been mayor of a city, we are required by law to balance our budgets in the state of California. We did so effectively. We went to raise taxes when we had to make sure that our budgets were balanced, that our services were properly funded. This is the way good government ought to be conducted. I think, as a matter of fact, neither the Democratic Party nor the Republican Party at the national level have any credibility in these respects. But I would say, Hugh, that during the 1970s, we as Democrats used to worry when we had a president running a budget deficit of $20 or $30 billion a year. In its final year, it zoomed up to $78 billion. Never in our wildest dreams would we have imagined that a Republican administration would preside over budgets of $200, $300, and even $400 billion a year.
That's a good argument, but I want to keep making sure that the people who are watching get your issues down. Capital punishment.
Yes. I'm very much opposed to capital punishment. I think this is not the way a civilized society deals with its very serious problems of lawlessness. I believe that in some instances, people ought to be put in prison for the rest of their natural lives without the possibility of parole, but I find it barbaric and unseemly when our party's nominee apparent, Governor Clinton, rushes off to Arkansas every few weeks to preside over an execution, when in fact I think the statesmanlike thing to have done would have been to have said during the pendency of this campaign, there will be no executions in the state of Arkansas, notwithstanding my support for the death penalty. If he were to say that, I think he would have acquitted himself much more effectively on this issue.
Gay and lesbian rights.
I not only support legislation that bars discrimination against gays and lesbians in housing, in jobs, in access to public accommodations. I wrote such a law for the city of Irvine. It was part of our comprehensive human rights ordinance that went way beyond extending protection to the traditional categories on the basis of race and on the basis of sex and national origin and religion. We barred discrimination that was being directed at gays and lesbians as well. I'd add that in standing by that ordinance, which was being fought bitterly, I think that was the single most important factor responsible for my defeat on re-election in that campaign of 1990.
Okay, looking ahead to November, the Californians, of course, are voting on June 2nd as to whether Larry Agran will get their vote for president. In November, they're going to vote on a choice initiative regarding their schools. Where do you stand on education, and where do you stand on choice among schools?
First, I believe we have to put much more money into public education. I say that because education reform without new resources is simply a fraud. I've proposed that $15 billion, or 10% of the peace dividend that's now available to us, be earmarked for direct assistance to public school districts. That's $375 per student per year, sent to every local school district in the country. Those funds used then to hire or rehire teachers, to improve teacher training, to reduce classroom sizes, to give teachers and students alike a fighting chance within our public school system to make that system work once again. I'm opposed to vouchers that would allow people to take public funds and put them into the private sector. I believe in choice within the public system, but not using public dollars to extend that choice and really bleed the public system of funds that would then go into the private side.
Okay, barely 5 weeks before the June 2nd primary, and when you're up against Bill Clinton, the governor, and you're up against Jerry Brown, a former governor, and you're a former mayor, all of a sudden the attention of the country is on the cities. The nation's mayors marched in Washington the past weekend before we taped this interview. What do you have to say to the people not only of Los Angeles but of every urban center about what the Los Angeles riots meant in terms of the Democratic Party, in terms of politics in general?
This is the price we pay for perverse federal priorities. Priorities that have put much more importance on the projection of military power abroad, overkill abroad, as opposed to investing in our cities, in our towns, in our neighborhoods here at home. Let me tell you, the fuse that was lit 10 years ago blew up in Los Angeles over the recent weeks. It could have been any American city, because when it comes to housing, we cut housing support by 80%. Transportation, education, you name it, across the board, federal support was flattened or reduced to the point where we were seriously suffering a diminution of services over the course of the entire decade. Now it's blown up in our phases. I believe we have to invest much more money in our cities and towns in essential public services, public health, welfare programs that really work by getting people through the welfare system and into public employment and private employment wherever possible. Now, what you had here was Governor Clinton coming out to California. You had President Bush coming out, a lot of hand-wringing, a lot of exhortation to prayer and cooperation, but when it came to resources, they promised nothing. When that wasn't selling with the voters, what did they do? They rushed back to Washington, D.C., and in a flurry of self-satisfied bipartisanship, what did they say? They said, well, we've come up with this $6 billion package. Sounds great. $6 billion, not for Los Angeles, but spread out over the entire country. $6 billion, which is what we spend every 2 weeks in defense of cities in Western Europe against a non-existent enemy. We've got to get our priorities straight, or none of this is going to be straightened out here.
What about the underlying problem of race and race consciousness? The LA riots was about a lot more than not having money. It was about black and Korean violence. It was about black Latino violence. It was about white Latino, white Korean violence. It was a multicultural violence. How do you speak to improving race relations in the United States?
Well, one thing I've been saying on the campaign trail is we need a president, and we haven't had one in 25 years, who will give a major affirmative civil rights address. Think of it, the last president who spoke in an affirmative way about civil rights was Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson. Now, we have an entire generation completely disconnected from a traditional commitment to civil rights and human rights that can make all the difference in the world. If the president isn't talking the language of reconciliation and harmony and justice, then we're in deep, deep trouble. So I think language means a lot.
Is there anything in the order of enterprise zones or anything about unleashing capital to do the private market work inside of the urban centers that appeals to you?
I'm very flexible. Having been mayor of a city, I know the importance of the private sector, the development community. I know the importance of a mix between public resources and private resources. I think at this point, we have got to try a whole host of things. And then we've got to monitor those activities very carefully and decide honestly what's working and what isn't. We can't get hung up on all the ideological baggage that has, over the years, I think, allowed us to neglect the cities and argue instead about, well, should this be done as a public sector activity, a private sector activity? If we can invest in the private sector and encourage the private sector in ways to overcome these problems, I say more power to us if we manage to find the way.
The LA riots have also been a boon to the National Rifle Association. 28,000 guns have been sold in California in the 2 weeks after the riots to this interview. What's your position on gun control? Is it constitutional? Ought it to be advanced?
Well, of course, as a lawyer, you know it is constitutional. We have the right under the Constitution, under the laws of the United States of America, to regulate the trafficking in arms, the sale of arms, the possession of arms, and particularly this is so with weapons such as handguns that have no real reason for their existence other than the capacity to kill another human being. We have some 200 million handguns in this country. Here in the aftermath of these riots, we're selling handguns throughout the state at a rate of 10, 20, 30,000 a week. This is insane. It's absolute insanity. Now, one thing that I have proposed, in addition to stricter controls on the sale and possession of handguns, is mandatory liability insurance. At the time of sale of a handgun, it seems to me that the purchaser ought to be putting $50 on the table right then and there for mandatory liability insurance. And that would be an annual fee, $50 every year. Put it into a large insurance fund, several $billion a year, and out of that insurance fund, We would pay and compensate innocent victims of violent crime, and there are thousands and thousands of them who go uncompensated every year. We would hire police officers and prosecutors and have community-based policing to begin to make our neighborhoods safer once again and put truly violent criminals behind bars. And third, we would use those funds to buy back, by the millions, buy back these handguns, take them out of circulation, and neighborhood by neighborhood, make our communities safe once again.
Now, we've run down the standard package of issues, and whether you want to call it progressive, whether you want to call it from the left, whether you want to call it liberal, you are a package candidate, and Larry Agran could actually sell himself as being the true progressive soul of the Democratic Party that was represented by Reverend Jackson 4 years ago. But it didn't take. It didn't take. Do you attribute that to the blackout, or do you attribute that to the fact that a mayor just can't run for president in the United States?
Well, I think a mayor could run successfully for president. If a $3 billionaire can run for president, if Dan Quayle can be elected vice president, if Pat Buchanan, who never ran for anything, can engage an audience across the country. There are ideas out there and people out there whose messages, I think, merit a listenership. The real problem has been that I belong to a party, a Democratic Party, that systematically sought to exclude me. It wasn't the party alone. They worked with the media moguls who were very happy to accept the explanation that there are only 4 or 5 or 6 major candidates. No one else is major. No one else has anything to offer. This is such a serious disservice to our democracy that it's tragic. It cuts off me and, in turn, thousands and millions of people from the opportunity to have a real dialogue about the future of our country. I'm perfectly willing to accept a fair judgment of the American people after they've heard me, a fair judgment from the American people as to whether or not they want to hear any more from me and from my candidacy. That was not the case, however. I was excluded from the major televised debates early on, and so was marginalized from the beginning. I've carried on, not just out of stubbornness, but because I believe that this campaign, the Agran for President campaign, is a campaign of principle, a commitment to new national priorities that 2/3 of the American people at least are prepared to embrace. And at the least we ought to be discussing these things. And then the American people ought to decide.
On June 2nd, Larry Agran's name is on that ballot. And the only reason really to vote for you is a protest vote at this point. Bill Clinton has it sealed and delivered. And Jerry Brown has the same appeal, protest. What are they protesting if someone pulls the lever for Larry Agran? What's the message that they're sending to Bill Clinton and the Democratic Party?
Well, it's not just a protest vote. I like to think of it as an affirmative vote, too. Because if people vote for me here in California, if I were to get as little as 2 to 3% of the vote, when you have a nominee such as Governor Clinton who's going to be struggling for every percentage point that he can make, you're going to have, I think, a powerful message sent that there is a sizable segment of our party committed to new national priorities, very different, dramatically different from what has been offered previously. We've got to put forward the first post-Cold War candidacy in the United States of America. And if Governor Clinton doesn't do that, then I'm sure our party will go down to defeat in November. If, on the other hand, a vote for me can help nudge him, shove him in that direction, then I think we will be on the road to not only making our party stronger, but earning the trust of the American people and the right to govern once again.
Whether you get 3%, 5%, 10%, whether you astonish the pundits, Clinton's the nominee. What's ahead for Larry Agran after the June 2nd ballot?
Well, I don't know what the future holds for me. I do think that if Governor Clinton were wise, he would be reaching out not just to me, but to disaffected Democrats all over this country. He would try to build the country into a much broader-based democracy, build our party into a much broader-based democracy. If he were to do that, I think he would stand some chance. I would love to be a part of an administration that was organized to redirect resources and committed to a much more progressive program. I don't know whether Governor Clinton has the capacity to do that. I hope he does.
You've got about 1 minute left, Larry Agran, to use public television's invitation to you to talk to the people of California about why they should vote for you. We'll just turn that over to you, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to interview you as to why, again, your message is out there and why you've campaigned from August till June with very little, a handful of delegates, but why you did it.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Hugh. And I want to thank those of you who have been listening for this important opportunity to share with you my point of view about the issues of the day. I think it's imperative that every 4 years we have a presidential race that is not just a contest of personalities, but it's a contest of principle. That's what I've tried to do from the very beginning, conduct this campaign as a campaign of principle based on a call for bold new national priorities. That's what the American security, the new American security that I've been talking about refers to. The opportunity to bring those resources home from Europe, from Japan, to cancel needless weapon systems, to end foreign military aid that historically has gone to dictators, to bring home to the American people a $150 billion a year peace dividend, direct aid to cities and towns across this country, rebuilding our healthcare system, aid to education, providing environmental protection that is stepped up to clean up our toxic and nuclear waste sites, and yes, engaging in the kind of honest deficit reduction that will be a credit to this generation and a gift to future generations that otherwise will be burdened by debt beyond all reason. I'm hoping that on June 2nd, the people of the state of California will not waste their votes by voting for a candidacy in which they do not believe. If you support Governor Clinton, vote for him. If you support Governor Brown, vote for him. If, on the other hand, you support a bold call for new national priorities, please consider me, please consider Agran for president. I'm on the ballot on June 2nd and would welcome your support. Thanks so much.
Larry Agran, Democratic candidate for president with just a few days to go before the California primary. What will you be doing in these last few days before the voting?
Well, mostly I'll be talking with people by way of talk radio programs, which are very popular here in California, a few TV opportunities that might be available to us, a campus appearance or two, and meeting with some supporters, especially in Southern California, where we have more support than elsewhere in the state.
When you're on the talk radio programs and people call in, what are they asking you about?
Well, typically they ask me, why haven't we heard about you before? Especially if they're attracted to the program. And of course I explain that as a lifelong Democrat, I've nevertheless had great difficulties being heard within my party in campaign forums and debates, and at the same time I remind them that I'm on the ballot in 40 states, especially here in California. So I try to give them a good reason to vote, and to vote for me is especially in light of the fact that here in California things are already decided nationally and our votes are largely votes of conscience at this point.
Why have you had trouble from the party, as you mentioned?
Well, I think a grave mistake has been made within the DNC by Ron Brown, chairman of our party, my party. The grave mistake has been this, to believe that somehow we could build a strong Democratic Party on a very narrow base that is tilting right, where the decisions are all made very early on in places like New Hampshire, South Dakota, Super Tuesday. Ron Brown's been very clear about this from the beginning. He wanted this thing over by Super Tuesday, and as a practical matter, it was. Well, that meant that people like me, voices at the margins, needed to be excluded from the beginning. And through the operation of Ron Brown's office, state party chairs, I've been excluded from most of the significant national debates. I have taken part in some debates, some forums. People have seen me on C-SPAN, on CNN, and elsewhere. But it hasn't been an opportunity to be a central part of that debate that I think, in the end, builds a far stronger party.
How has that exclusion manifested itself? Overt, subtle? How would you describe it?
Well, I think it's subtle initially, and it becomes pretty overt. The subtlety initially was this. In describing the field, Ron Brown would initially describe it as 6 candidates worth watching, when I in fact was one of 7 or 8 candidates worth watching. Then after that it became, when Doug Wilder dropped out, 5 candidates worth watching. Then the word was sent out to the media in that regard, and to party chairs, who then systematically in organizing debates and forums would say, well, we've got now 5 candidates. And people like me who were mounting true national campaigns, we've qualified for matching funds, I qualified for the ballot in over 40 jurisdictions, I simply couldn't be heard in these debates and in these forums. Now there were some exceptions In South Dakota, for example, the party was very open, and I participated in a statewide televised debate. In Massachusetts, it was a very open party. The U.S. Conference of Mayors invited me to participate in the presidential candidate forum there, alongside with the others. In Buffalo, New York, similarly, I was invited to participate with the others. But then we got to the Bronx in New York. Governor Clinton had said after the Buffalo debate that he wanted me included in every debate and forum for the balance of the campaign. Well, what happened in New York was that I was not invited to the Bronx debate. When I was not invited, even though I solicited an invitation time and again, I showed up nevertheless on the night of the debate, and I requested to be heard. I stood as a member of the audience, and I said, Mr. Chairman, I respectfully request to be heard. I want to be included in tonight's forum as one of 4 actively campaigning Democratic presidential candidates here in New York. I've participated elsewhere with these candidates, and by all rights, I should be included tonight. At that point, 6 security officers were all over me. They tackled me, dragged me into the aisle, down a flight of stairs head first. I was held in police custody for 4.5 hours. I was, of course, handcuffed initially. I was finally booked for disorderly conduct, if you can believe that, in the city of New York, booked for disorderly conduct for simply requesting the right to participate in a candidate forum as I had participated in others. So that's what it's come to in our party, a very closed, narrow party at this point. And I think what saddened me most about that particular event was that there they were, Governor Clinton and Governor Brown. Both of them know me. Both of them have shared forums with me. And neither of them spoke out and said, Larry Agran ought to be included in this debate. I'll tell you, if Jerry Brown had done that, he would have won the New York primary. Instead, he lost it and lost it badly.
We'll move along to some other topics, but before that, what's happened with that incident? Was it resolved at all?
No, not resolved. I thought they would drop the charges as soon as the New York primary was over, but in fact, they are prosecuting the case. Tentatively, a court date is set for July 13th, which happens to be the first day of the Democratic National Convention in New York. And so I'm looking forward to defending myself. I'll have a few things to say about what I regard as a political prosecution that is unbecoming a Democratic Party that ought to value democratic inclusion.
You mentioned receiving matching funds. What did your campaign have to accomplish to receive those funds?
Well, to raise matching funds, we had to raise $5,000 at least in 20 separate states in contributions of $250 or less. This is something that normally is a real challenge, and a definition of a national candidacy obviously became much more difficult for us being kept out of those initial nationally televised debates. But we went on to raise about $300,000 during the course of the campaign, most of it matchable, so we're very pleased to be able to continue a campaign, what I regard as a campaign of principle about very different choices and very different priorities for our country.
What effect on your campaign will this influx of federal funds mean?
Well, it means we're able to carry forward and stay in touch with our 10,000 to 15,000 supporters across the country, keeping them advised of what we're doing. Obviously, here in California, where we're competing June 2nd for primary votes, it allows us to travel about, to print literature, to distribute literature, to appear on radio and television, to do those things that a modest campaign, a campaign of principle, can still do.
Talk about what an Agran presidency would mean when you're on these programs and talking to people. What are your priorities as president?
My priorities, simply put, are these: to take immediate advantage of the end of the Cold War, to stop the nonsense of spending $300 billion a year for military purposes, to take 3 immediate steps to cut our military budget in half. Step number 1, removing all U.S. forces from Western Europe and Japan. Their work is done there. Bring the troops home, the dependents home, close up the bases there, and keep the bases here at home open as we receive those demobilized troops. Step number 2, cancel needless weapons systems like the B-2 bomber, the MX missile deployment system, Star Wars, these systems that cost us tens of billions of dollars and have no useful purpose whatsoever now. Let's convert those contracts to contracts to build mass transit, a railroad system for the United States of America, energy-efficient heating and cooling systems, affordable housing. Let's put our scientists and engineers to work doing those things that need doing. And step number 3, let's cut all foreign military aid, particularly that historically has gone to dictators in places like Iraq, El Salvador, and Panama. Then we take those $150 billion that ought to be available to us not in 5 or 10 years, but within 18 to 24 months at the most, and redirect that peace dividend of $150 billion a year to our cities and towns in direct aid, to our school districts, again in direct aid, to building and rebuilding a public health and national health care system worthy of the American people, to building a transportation system worthy of the American people, to reclaiming our environment, and earmarking as well about $50 billion for some honest deficit reduction. That's what an Agran presidency would be about. That's what our campaign has been about.
Where would the money in aid to the cities be directed?
I would propose sending $25 billion, or $100 per resident per year, to every city and town in America. It's a reenactment and enlargement of the old general revenue sharing program. No strings attached. Just return the resources to people at the local level. What would they do with it? Well, they'd probably use it to repair infrastructure, maybe to hire more police officers and engage in community policing, community-based and neighborhood-based policing, open and reopen public health clinics, libraries, child care centers. We know how to rebuild our cities and our towns from the neighborhoods right on up. We just need the resources. I certainly know this as someone who has served in local government for over 12 years and had the privilege to be mayor of my city for 6 years. Now look what happened. Los Angeles burned for the second time in my adult lifetime. I grew up in Los Angeles. Governor Clinton and President Bush visited Los Angeles. They engaged in a lot of hand-wringing, a lot of expressions of anguish. They promised nothing by way of material assistance. All they did was exhort us to pray and to cooperate. And then they got back to Washington, D.C., recognizing that this was not a message that was about to sell to the American people. So they patched together a self-serving, self-satisfied, bipartisan package of $6 billion in emergency urban aid, not just to Los Angeles, but for every city and town needing it in the country. By the time you slice up that pie, nobody's going to taste anything. Well, what I propose is that we earmark what we're earmarking for Europe, $6 billion every 2 weeks to defend Western European cities. We don't begin to spend that kind of money for American cities, but if we did, it would make all the difference in the world. 2 weeks, we spend $6 billion in Western Europe. $6 billion is the total package that we spend for American cities in this emergency urban aid package.
In this campaign season, many candidates are using the buzzwords an insider candidate, an outsider candidate. How would you describe yourself?
Well, as the guy who has been literally dragged out of an auditorium where a debate should have been taking place, I guess I'm the ultimate outsider, sitting in a police wagon for a couple of hours and then being booked at the Bronx police station for simply asserting my right to participate as I had participated elsewhere. I guess that describes me as the ultimate outsider. I've never been arrested in my life, and here I am as a presidential candidate, arrested for the first time for disorderly conduct, simply asserting my right to be heard, but more important than my right to be heard, the right of millions of people to hear my voice and decide for themselves whether or not my ideas are worthy of support.
Part of a national campaign is dealing with the press.
Yeah.
How has the press treated you?
Well, it's been interesting. In some cases, we've received a lot of attention. Local press is no problem. Reporters are happy to talk with us. I've been on the MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour, CNN. I was on the Larry King radio show. I think that these kinds of appearances that are public affairs, particularly radio talk shows, I think are extremely valuable. Those have been available to me, and I've enjoyed that opportunity. But I'll tell you, the real problem is in framing the choices. And if at the beginning of this long road to the White House, which has proved to be something of a cul-de-sac for me, if this long road to the White House is framed by choices at the beginning that are very narrow, where the mainstream media say, oh, there are only 5 candidates. Oh, there are only 6 candidates. There are none others in the field. That really is a very sinister development in our system that has the effect of precluding voices at the margin that in fact are voices that people want to hear. That's the meaning of the Perot phenomenon. Here he is now being lavished with all this coverage, largely because people are so disgusted at the narrow choices that have been presented to them by traditional party hacks in the Democratic Party as well as in the Republican Party.
When you talked to people in the media about why you might not have gotten coverage at the national level, what kind of answers have you gotten?
Usually it's something like this: well, tell us when you're getting some coverage, because then we'll know we ought to be covering you. And as a matter of fact, a story along those lines was written in the Columbia Journalism Review, their magazine, that highlighted exactly the dynamic that's taking place here. You've got to be well known to get known, and when you don't get covered, of course, you fall in the polls and so forth. It was particularly frustrating to me when in January in New Hampshire, against overwhelming odds in 2 consecutive tracking polls, I had overtaken Jerry Brown. And when finally that second tracking poll was reported, Tom Harkin had 7%. We three were at the bottom, of course. Tom Harkin had 7%, I had 4%, and Jerry Brown had 3%. On ABC News on Super Sunday, it was reported Tom Harkin 7%, Jerry Brown 3%. My 4% wasn't even reported, my name wasn't even listed. It was an overt act of political censorship on the part of ABC News, which distorted the news for the American people, and of course did great damage to our campaign. And when we called them about it, their response was, oh, that was the weekend crew. Well, some excuse. I mean, this is a serious act of political distortion. And we just have, I think, a very arrogant press. I speak of the national media, particularly the broadcast media, highly arrogant, a power unto themselves, who feel responsible to no one, accountable to no one, for the abysmal standards that they're upholding.
You mentioned earlier Ross Perot. What effect is his possibly entering the race having not only on the entire campaign but on what you're doing?
Well, I think his candidacy is attractive to many of my supporters, largely because they are entirely frustrated. They feel the system is totally unresponsive to them. So they're interested in the Perot candidacy. Obviously, there's always the concern about what specifics he holds to be important, or whether or not he'll speak with specificity. They're concerned, too, whether or not he's a racist or whether or not he's some kind of an anti-labor zealot. So far, I must say, my own reaction has been generally positive. He is speaking to the concerns of the American people. And so far as to those specifics that he has enunciated, I think what he says, much of it is very meritorious. He is going to shake up the system in a way that it has not been shaken up in recent years. I wish my candidacy had had that effect. I think within the Democratic Party it would have had that effect, but in a much more constructive way, opening the party's doors to an entire generation of people who feel closed out.
In these final few days before the primary, where are you marshaling your resources? Where are you focusing?
Well, principally spending time here in Orange County, which is where I was active politically. Orange County is a sizable county, even though it's a rightward-leaning county. There are lots of Democrats here, and we want to get them out to the polls. I was up in Santa Cruz as well, spending time in that university community, hoping for some support there. And I'll be spending as much time as I can on, as I say, talk radio shows, where we reach thousands and thousands of people at a time. We're making a lot of phone calls, hoping to register a 1 to 2% result here in California, which I think will provide a tiny amount of leverage for us at the Democratic National Convention and beyond. After all, our party's presumptive nominee, Bill Clinton, can't afford to kiss off even 1% or 2% of the vote. This is a man who will desperately need to broaden the party's base, and I hope he will be coming to me in that regard, as I hope he will be approaching others.
You'll be attending the convention?
Well, I'll be attending first by starting out at the Bronx Criminal Court, and then I do hope there'll be a place for me at the convention, although I want to note that I have not been advised in that regard by Ron Brown. No one has spoken to me from Governor Clinton's campaign. I think this is a measure of the narrow nature of our current Democratic Party. I'm happy to receive a phone call, however, and cooperate in whatever ways I can.
Larry Agran is a Democratic candidate for president. Thank you very much.
Thank you. May I do one more thing?
Sure.
Leave my 800 number for folks. I've been carrying this around. There we go. Our campaign is still going. 1-800-727-9425. We're eager to stay in touch with people because this campaign will continue long after the convention.
Thanks for taking time.
Thank you. Appreciate it.